So I would like to talk to you for a second about Curtis Marean's hypothesis about humans becoming the dominant force on the planet. And finally being able to successfully migrate from Africa. Let me just go forward here for a second. Okay. So what you're seeing here is a gross representation of what the vegetation in Africa looks like currently. Okay. So you have the Sahara up here is a desert. You have the Karoo desert here. You have tropical forest, woodland, bushland thicket. Pinnacle Point here is where Curtis Marean discovered some caves that have the earliest complex projectile technology within it. Also discovered there the earliest example of pyrotechnic heat treatment technique, which was dated at about 160,000 years ago. So this is the vegetation, the estimated vegetation currently. It is also what is more likely, like what Africa would more likely look like before this glacial period that I mentioned before. And I'm going to mention it again. But certainly humans have lived inside of Africa and live inside of Africa when it looks like this, and the resource reality is a little bit more replete. Here is what that resource reality looks like during the penultimate glacial period, 194 to 135,000 years ago. So you see, there are very few areas where you're going to have terrestrial hunting and gathering. Almost the entirety of the continent is desert. So this would have an obvious effect on resource competition for any Homo species or fauna that are working to get the resources. Very important. So these areas are potential, what are known as refugium. So if humans are in play here in Africa, there are very few areas that they can live in. And so our numbers at the time are probably not that great. And so competition amongst Homo species and Homo sapiens is going to go up for resources. Again, let's come back here. This is what it looks like before. Potentially even it's going to be different. It's hard for us to know what Africa looked like, 200,000, 300,000 years ago. But based upon what information is there, it more likely looks like how it looks currently. Then it looks like this. Then it goes back to looking like this. Right. So here we are during this period of this penultimate glacial period. And for lack of a better term, early Homo sapiens get trapped down in these refugium, but they definitely get trapped down in Pinnacle Point. We know that they're down there because of Curtis Marean's evidence. We know that they're down there using pyrotechnic heat treatment in the caves of Pinnacle Point, right dead in the middle of the glacial period. So we are down here doing coastal foraging, which is different from fishing. Coastal foraging is a long discussion, but it's a dangerous business. You have to know the tides, all of that kind of stuff. And if there are multiple groups of humans down here in Pinnacle Point, they're almost certainly competing over resources and almost certainly fighting one another regularly. So this is important because we are going to talk about this concept called a natural selection regime, which is nature sets up a regime to decide in a being which attributes are going to move forward and which attributes are going to stay in the past. So Curtis Marean's theory is that this glacial period created an eye of the needle for our genetics and our behavior. And three things were critical to our survival. Number one would be advanced cognition, because in order for you to successfully forage on the coastline, you would have to understand the tides and potentially the relationship between the moon and the tides. You would have to understand how to create the advanced projectile tip. So likely you would have to be able to communicate well and communicate in a way that honored the fine detail of those processes that make the projectile tip. And so that also would take advanced cognition. The other thing would be the capacity, or what Curtis calls hyperprosociality. So earlier hominins and chimpanzees don't know how to group together at a larger number without exceptional infighting. So that's called a band when you have 10 or 20 or 25 beings in your band or your troop, and you can't scale beyond that because then you end up having too much infighting. Well, what humans figured out based upon Curtis's hypothesis is that they figured out how to be hyperprosocial. So they figured out a way to get past that limit and have larger groups without infighting, more cooperation. So once you have a tribe that can go 150 people, and you have other hominins or other humans who cannot get past 25 people, you have a superior entity, right? A tribe becomes a superior entity. And those humans that are able to do that, to communicate and be diplomatic and not get caught up in conflicts of interest and fighting, those beings are going to have, in this scenario, are going to have a greater chance of survival. The larger group has a greater chance of survival over the smaller group concept where the beings can't cooperate and create a larger group. So this is likely what happened in Pinnacle Point. In order to survive the harsh glacial period and to get through the eye of the needle, these humans had to have advanced cognition traits, hyperprosociality traits, and they needed to have the capacity to create the advanced projectile. All of the beings that were there that were unable to do that, they either got absorbed into the mega tribe or they were killed or they died from lack of resources. So once you come to the other side of that natural selection regime, once you have the other side of the natural selection regime, when Africa goes back to looking like this, from this, here's the natural selection regime in the glacial period, and it goes back to looking like this. Excuse me. Humans are then free to move about the cabin again. And they go on, this Pinnacle Point group goes on to then affect all of the remaining or existing Homo sapiens that were in the other refugium, in the other refuge areas. And this biosocial, genetic, and cultural reality goes on to become the dominant force for humans. And humans now have the capacity to not just be dominant. This group has a tendency or the capacity to be dominant relative to other Homo sapiens. They are now dominant relative to all other fauna. So other Homo species, and then we can kill with that technology and our capacity to hunt in large numbers and advanced cognition. We then go on to kill every known huntable animal on the planet. So on one side of this, on one side of this natural selection regime, let's actually go back here. When we're in this original state before the glacial period, we are low in numbers and we are constantly preyed upon like other animals. We're not the dominant force on the planet. We're just like all others. we have some crafty tendencies, most likely. We go into the natural selection regime being equal to all other things. And we are not dominant, we are prey. But this natural selection regime, by the way, which takes about 60,000 years, produces a different kind of Homo sapien. And that kind of Homo sapien is smarter, craftier, and can scale up its group beyond what other fauna can do, and has a new projectile technology that allows the delivery of death from a distance from many, many warriors, many hunters and fighters. So that we become a machine that ends up having this resource reality again, and we become the dominant force now. And as the Pinnacle Point group pushes out and influences things over tens of thousands of years, that genetic reality takes over. And that becomes us. That's what we are. Because then we are finally able to successfully work our way up, potentially the coast, and then out of Africa into the Levant and around the Mediterranean, over to Australia, boats, India, up to Northern Europe, over the Bering Strait land bridge. But it is the natural selection regime here that enables that. And there are three portions to that: hyperprosociality, advanced cognition, and that projectile point. If you don't have the projectile technology, it likely doesn't happen. So then it begs the question, how important is the human-weapon relationship? Well, out of Africa may not have happened without it. And our dominance on the planet and our footprints on the moon may not have happened without it. So is that a slam dunk argument? No, it's not. It's a solid argument. It's a substantive argument, and it's a good argument. So how important is the human-weapon relationship? For multiple reasons, whether it's successful hunting over the 99% of the time we've been on this planet, or the out of Africa theory with it, we wouldn't be here if we didn't have the human-weapon relationship. So again, when you have neo-progressives and neoliberals trying to push an existence paradigm concept as if weapons are not important, it's preposterous. It's preposterously anti-scientific. So let's go over Curtis's hypothesis in summary, directly taken from a Curtis Marean slide in one of his presentations. So 250 to 200,000 years ago, we are foraging for predictable resources, and that elevates territoriality and conflict, evolutionary selection regime for hyperprosociality and collective intentionality. So resources are one of the things, resource reality and conflict force this thing where you're either going to learn how to create a greater group and not infight, or you're not. And if you cannot create a tribe or a mega tribe, you're going to lose out. So the resource reality starts to push humans in that direction. And then that leads us to the Glacial Period. So the emergence of complex cognition and the emergence of the modern human lineage in coastal South Africa. This is the eye of the needle. So genetically speaking, it is believed that there is one parent group for all of us that are existing now, and it is likely that it is that Southern Africa, south coast of South Africa group. The Pinnacle Point samples that group. Pinnacle Point caves and evidence samples that group. Okay, 100,000 years ago, we start the formation of multi-tiered society. Bands fuse into tribes. Humans transcend hominin social limits, right? So hyperprosociality happens in the eye of the needle, and you're either capable of doing it or you're not. If you're not capable of doing it, you die off. If you're capable of doing it, you get absorbed into the new human biosocial reality. About 73,000 years ago, earliest evidence for the emergence of the Homo sapiens weapons industry. The caves of Pinnacle Point, complex projectiles, pyrotechnic heat treatment. This is the beginning of our anthropologic weapons industry, and it has never stopped since that moment. 70,000 years ago, dominant South Coastal Africans absorb, replace gene pool of all pre-existing Homo sapiens as species successfully migrates from Africa. Okay, so the parent group is working out and back and forth and affecting all of the existing Homo sapiens in the rest of Africa. And then that gene pool ends up becoming successful and moving out of Africa. Once those beings push out of Africa, that's us. That's who we are. That's our genetic reality. Our genetic reality hasn't changed since then. That's our anatomic reality, right? A lot of our behavioral reality and cognitive reality. We're more sophisticated now, but the very basis of it is mostly the same. That's the argument. So the map of the human behavioral baseline. I don't want to spend too much time on this. It is a key for those who deal with the liberal gun owner's lens, anthropillar. Not many people do. It's more of a key for me. But I'll go over it quickly. There's no two things more prime for humans than our reproduction and survival. Everywhere we go, that's what we deal with. 80% of all humans will reproduce. Every 30 seconds on this planet, 60 humans die. 120 humans die a minute on Earth. Does survival matter for humans? I would say so. You can't have reproduction or survival without self-interest. Humans have immense self-interest. And because we have self-interest, other people have self-interest. And that means that there are conflicts of interest. In the ancient realm, in the older realm, the deeper anthropologic realm, our self-interest can drive into different forms of aggression and cooperation. Directly from self-interest, we can go into aggression and hunt other animals so that we can eat. We have self-interest that drives into conflicts of interest with other humans. And there are two things that we use for that. When we have conflicts of interest, we are going to solve those conflicts of interest with some form of aggression or some sort of cooperation or some form of both. We still do that to this day. And there definitely is a path with conflicts of interest with humans prior and humans now to have a conflict of interest, go the aggressive path, and immediately go into weapons usage against other humans. So fighting and armed conflict are a principal vehicle for human conflict resolution historically, anthropologically. There are ways to solve the conflicts of interest, but we certainly often go to aggression and straight to weapons usage against other humans. We're not going to go too much into group creation, social coercion, social hierarchy, strict hierarchy, and democratized hierarchy. That's another lecture entirely. But it certainly all does lead us to this reality of when we have conflicts of interest, we involve ourselves in dealing with those conflicts of interest through what is known as coercion or social coercion. And there is a form of social coercion that I call weapons-based social coercion. So this is a theory of Paul Bingham's that I have adjusted a little bit. And so it is important to understand weapons-based social coercion because it still exists in our life right now. And our society is tied into weapons-based social coercion. So let's go to social coercion from Encyclopedia Britannica. Coercion, threat or use of punitive measures against states, groups, or individuals in order to force them to undertake or desist from specified actions. In addition to the threat of or limited use of force or both, coercion may entail economic sanctions, psychological pressures, and social ostracism. The concept of coercion should be distinguished from persuasion, which entails getting another party to follow a particular course of action or behavior by appealing to the party's reason and interests, as opposed to threatening or implying punitive measures. The use of coercion has, of course, been one of the key tools for acquiring dominion and sustaining governance by states, political groupings, and individuals. So if you're somebody who doesn't believe that coercion exists, you've never been in a relationship. Humans are jockeying to try to get what they want in visible and invisible ways, covert and overt. And while I would never say that humans don't know how to act unconditionally, most of what we do has a condition involved. And we go back to Haidt's Rider and the Elephant. We are driven by the elephant, and most of our coercive vectors are in the elephant. And a lot of us fool ourselves relative to the fact that we are involved in coercion. If you want a good example of coercion, then the nexus point between firearms ownership and public safety is a great place to be, to understand that, because that's all it is. It's coercion from one group or the other, right? Liberals are involved in social coercion. Conservatives are involved in social coercion. I would argue that liberals' social coercion is supposed to be a principal art form for liberals. So let's go over weapons-based social coercion theory. Human beings are ultimately driven by the desire for reproduction and survival. 2, human beings have discovered that the increase of desirable outcomes for these drives is maximized by living in groups. Sociality, hyperprosociality. You have to scale up if you want leverage in society. 3, because human beings live in groups, conflicts of interest always arise, producing intergroup and intragroup conflict. Again, very similar to that map of the human behavioral baseline. 4, humans automatically engage in social coercion to deal with problems, placing behavioral pressure on other humans or other human groups to guide or produce more favorable outcomes. This is ancient anthropologic behavioral policing. All groups are involved in various versions of behavioral policing with no exceptions. All human groups do it. You can't stop it. There are people that can recognize that and people that stay blind to it. But if you have a group of humans being social, there's going to be behavioral policing. 5, social coercion can and often does operate from a behavioral formula that includes both cooperation and aggression. The idea that we always use cooperation and that humans aren't aggressive. This is another one of these like myths of neoliberals, and that when people are inside of a group, they're being unconditional. It's just entirely not true. Yes, we can be cooperative and kind and empathetic and all of that stuff. And sometimes we're maximizing those things. But there's always aggression. Also, the idea that only males are aggressive and females are not aggressive, or non-binary people are not aggressive, is also bullshit, right? Humans are aggressive. And scientifically, males have a tendency to be more physically aggressive, and females are socially aggressive and can be highly socially aggressive. 6, since the evolution of cooperation is critical to human survival, human groups will develop effective intergroup behavioral norms and will engage in third-party punishment in regards to maintaining these norms. No exceptions. Third-party punishment is I'm in charge of the group and I punish you, person A, for harming or doing wrong to person B. And we have a society that is built upon that, and most of advanced society is built upon third-party punishment, where our law enforcement or the state or our laws punish people for doing wrong. Weapons-based social coercion theory, part 7. Since survival is the ultimate concern for humans, and since this drives humans to seek favorable outcomes concerning survival, humans will seek to risk engaging in intergroup and intragroup conflict through a decisive form of lethal threat when necessary. The in case of emergency break glass part of social coercion is using weapons. A decisive threat can deliver more favorable outcomes for human groups. See human history. Decisive threat is used by humans to maintain norms, to maintain agreements, and to approach third-party punishment. For the risk of conflict to be worth it, the action needs to maximize threat to the target of the punishment while minimizing the threat to the threat generator. The threat of coercive violence or the delivery of this violence is the principal evolutionary behavioral foundation for humans in dealing with the conflicts of interest. So, projectiles matter because you can deliver a threat from a distance, maximize safety for yourself and your group, maximize danger to the other group who potentially does not have a projectile. And so you should start to see this picture in how we deal with the rule of law and the police in this society. We're going to ask you to be nice and follow the rules, and ask you to be nice and follow the rules. And if you don't, somebody's going to show up, and that somebody's going to have a projectile. We don't do it necessarily at the tribal level now, where the tribal elders and the warriors are coming in with projectiles to get you to do something. We just have a state and a government, and we have a law, and we have police. And the police will have the projectiles, and they're going to show up if you start to cross the line a little bit too much. Because of this, humans have an exceptional, evolutionarily reinforced interest in cooperative force and in weapon systems that facilitate the projection of threat from a distance. Decisive projectile weapons facilitate the evolutionary instinct to maximize safety for the threat, as I've been saying, a generator, and maximize danger for the target. Decisive numbers for a group of warriors, threat generators, are also an exceptional component of successful social coercion. More people, more projectiles, definitive threat, force multiplication. 9, both elites and commoners will seek to gain an advantage in human groups through maximizing social coercion. So haves versus have-nots, people with money and power will seek advantage, and everyday people will seek advantage. Elite control of human groups is a well-established anthropologic issue for humans and historically threatens general species survivability. Both top-down and bottom-up enhancements to social coercion are a fundamental anthropologic feature. So rich people, wealthy people, powerful people will potentially in one scenario have influence over the warrior class or have influence over the army or the government. And bottom-up people, the everyday people, can use projectiles and large-scale populations to create pressure in the other direction. Now, I should say as an aside, most social coercion doesn't involve weaponry, and there are many, many other things that are much more potent and effective for social coercion other than weapons. But this is weapons-based social coercion theory is talking about that realm of, in case of emergency, break glass. We don't use weapons for coercion as regularly, potentially, as we did at one point. So, but this thing between haves and have-nots, as evidenced in the very creation of America, is salient, and it's still with us right now. 10, ultimately, our capacity for humane behavior is a Darwinian adaptation, and this is made possible by our Darwinian capacity to suppress inhumane behavior through conjoint collective threat. Now, this is directly the words of Paul Bingham. This potential coercion and deterrence is created by our exceptional ability to enact interpersonal violence through the application of decisive projectile weapon. The decisive projectile weapon creates or contributes to the prohibitory behavioral state in humans that allows human scale cooperation to blossom. So, humans are very good at a number of things. Dealing with bullies is one of them. Your group can't survive if you have bullies at the top of your group that are always trying to suck the resources away. So we've understood this culturally, and so we've devised an adaptation inside of ourselves to gather together and to fight in an upward fashion towards elites and collectives that are trying to bully the rest of society and hog all the resources. So we're exceptional at this. So what ends up happening is our capacity to be humane comes from directly out of the capacity for us to suppress bullies. Right? So we are humane towards one another because we know, generally speaking, in our history, that in our tribes and in our groups, there's always a conglomerate of power that tries to collect and tries to abuse everybody else. So our care and concern for one another and the bigger picture is what pulls us together for hyperprosociality. And when we need to, we include weapons in that to deal with the bullies at the top. Okay? That's weapons-based social coercion theory. The good news for us is that we can do that more effectively in most cases without the use of weapons. But in case of emergency break glass, humans know that they can use weapons to do that. And that is weapons-based social coercion theory. That could be a constant discussion, but it's very important that it is introduced here. So there is ultimate anthropologic reasoning for firearms, for projectiles in general, but for firearms and for the semi-automatic rifle particularly, which I cover and will cover later in another lecture that I will publish on semi-automatics in the AR-15 anthropologically. But the ultimate anthropologic reasoning for guns, particularly semi-automatics, but particularly the semi-automatic rifle, which I will talk about later. These are the ultimate anthropologic reasons for it. Now, first and foremost, before I get into these concepts, number one, there is, what is it, 1, 2, 3, I think I'm counting it as 3 ultimate reasons, the ultimate reasoning for the presence of firearms in society and with humans. One is the acquisition of animal protein. It's always primary for humans to have the capacity to acquire animal protein. So we don't do it as much now. Some of us hunt, but it's not necessary. There are grocery stores and farms, but ultimately, for 99% of our existence on this planet, we needed to have projectiles to acquire animal protein for survival. And so that never changes. The reason for the ultimate reasoning for firearms is the ultimate reasoning for projectiles, complex projectiles. So the ultimate reasoning, first part of ultimate reasoning is the acquisition of animal protein. The second is the expression of interpersonal violence, offensive or defensive. Okay? Not hobby, not sport, not playtime with guns, not collection, right? Not, ooh, I like the mechanisms. Not that. The expression of interpersonal violence, offensive or defensive. And then in the equation of social coercion, animal protein, interpersonal violence, and social coercion. That's why guns are on the planet. That's why there are guns. That's why people own guns ultimately. And some people are playing at it and they're on the rider and they have no idea what's going on inside of the elephant and the other part of themselves. Some people think it's just about self-defense. Well, self-defense is about social coercion. It's about the expression of violence. Most of what goes on in the root of what goes on with guns and why we do guns and why guns are here are in the elephant. And Haidt's rider in the elephant. They're in the elephant. They're in the primitive brain. They're in the deep part of us. So in order for us to understand this, we have to understand the ultimate reasoning for this stuff. Hunting, interpersonal violence, social coercion. So, democratize weaponry. Humans are going to desire democratized weaponry. Force adequate, decisive local weapons have to be reasonably affordable and available to common people. It is the true anthropologic counterforce to exceptional abuse. Democratized weaponry is deep. The desire for it is deep inside of the ultimate reasoning. And there is historical proof that it works. There is historical proof that it offsets exceptional abuse. That's why we desire it. Not hobby, not sport. The force adequate weapon. A weapon does not have to be superior to be decisive in coercing someone else. It just has to be adequate in its power, and it needs to be reasonably scalable. The semi-automatic rifle is a force adequate weapon. It's not a nuclear bomb. It's not a sidewinder on a combat jet. It's adequate. It's adequate enough to be the most important weapon for the everyday person when you scale it up, you have enough people and you have enough semi-automatic rifles, you can keep jets from going into the air with their sidewinders. You can keep other people from going into the nuclear silo or from turning the key. So is the semi-automatic rifle more powerful in the conventional sense than the nuclear bomb? Of course it's not, but for the everyday person, it is certainly adequate to have a maximized decisive capacity in some sort of a conflict. Weapons mirroring. If Tribe B loses to Tribe A and the loss is obviously attributable to an advanced weapons technology that Tribe B does not possess, Tribe B will likely attempt to attain the novel weapon and copy it. Humans copy highly effective weapons technology. When we can afford it, when the materials are there or the capacity is there, we are going to mirror the weaponry of what the other people have. So we can see the Trump effect on this, where you have the Trump era bringing sort of an emboldening to fascistic, nationalistic, xenophobic sentiment. And many of these people have AR-15s and semi-automatics and semi-automatic pistols. And this drove many people right in front of our eyes from marginalized groups to just get the same thing, right? And that happened a lot, and it will happen again, because that's what we do. We mirror the force potential of the other group's weapons. And of course, decisive local weapons, in order for a weapon to have decisive power, it must have the capacity to project or deliver threat in a way that suppresses or influences the behavior of other humans. Weapons-based social coercion cannot be achieved without decisiveness. You cannot have decisive coercive power over other humans with slingshots. You cannot have decisive coercive power if you have a single-shot .22 rifle, and the person that you need to coerce has a giant machine gun. The weapon has to have a decisive capacity. It does not always have to be the most powerful, but it has to be able to be used and potentially scaled up realistically to project decisive threat. So, can you have a decisive local weapon with a revolver? Maybe there's an argument there, but no. Can you have a decisive local weapon with a pump-action shotgun? Maybe. It's getting pretty close. But in the reality, in the tech reality that we are in, the semi-automatic mechanism, magazine-fed, is the only way really to get a decisive local weapon. It's the only way that it's force adequate, right? So why do we own these things, right? I just laid it out. This is the anthropologic reasoning for it. Democratized weaponry, the force adequate weapon, weapons mirroring, and decisive local weapons or weaponry. So this brings us to the end of the human weapon relationship discussion portion of this lecture. So if anybody wants to ask any questions or engage in a serious discussion, because I'm not doing comment section discussions, liberalgunowners@gmail.com. That's where I am. If you want to have a serious discussion about these things, liberalgunowners@gmail.com. If enough people are interested, which I doubt because everybody's in the superficial realm, but if you want to have a discussion, there are enough people, I would easily have an open discussion group that was private with some of you that are more mature and serious about this. So liberalgunowners@gmail.com. If you like this material and what we're doing, there's going to be more of it. If you want to contribute, that would be helpful. Go to liberalgunowners.org or lgolens.com. There's donate buttons to smash there. We could really use it. So thank you guys again. And this is the 2022 Sociology of Guns lecture. The human weapon relationship. I should also say some of the things that I did in the class, I did not do here, and I added back some things here to this online version. There was a treatment for the AR-15 that I did for David Yamani for those students, and I removed that because I'm going to do a standalone lecture like this on the AR-15 now that I've done the background, the ultimate reasoning. I'm going to do a standalone on semi-automatics and the AR-15. I should say that. So again, Hit us up with a donation at liberalgunowners.org if you can, liberalgunowners@gmail.com for all contact on this lecture. Thank you guys very much.